6 companies just rewired their leadership at the exact same moment the quantum computing industry stopped being a science experiment and started being a business. If you think that is a coincidence, you have not been paying attention to what is happening underneath the surface of this industry right now. Money is moving, boards are shifting, and the people being hired are not physicists anymore. They are lawyers, financiers, and operators who know how to run a company that's about to answer to shareholders. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand why the single week of appointments might be one of the clearest signals yet that quantum computing has entered a completely new phase. Before we get into the names and the titles, ask yourself a simple question. Why would 6 separate companies, spread across 5 different countries, all restructure their leadership teams within the same handful of weeks? Companies do not coordinate like that on purpose. What actually happens is that an entire industry hits an inflection point at roughly the same time, and every serious player suddenly needs the same kind of talent to survive the next stage. That is what you're watching right now in real time, and very few people outside this industry have noticed it yet. And let's set the scene first, because context is everything here. For most of quantum computing's history, the people running these companies were founders. They were physicists who built a lab, proved a concept, raised a few $1 million, and kept experimenting. That was the entire playbook. For almost 2 decades, nobody needed a chief financial officer with public markets experience. Nobody needed a chief legal officer who understood intellectual property litigation at scale. The industry simply was no big enough or serious enough to require that kind of talent. That era is now over, and the 6 leadership changes we are about to walk through prove it beyond any doubt. According to the most recent industry analysis, quantum computing drew $8.3 billion in investment in 2025 alone. That is nearly 5 times what the industry raised the year before. And the report behind that number makes a very specific point. This increase was not driven by more deals happening. It was driven by the size of each individual deal getting dramatically larger. In other words, investors are not spreading small bets across many companies anymore. They are writing enormous checks into companies they believe have already proven something real. When that kind of capital starts flowing, the leadership teams receiving it have to change to match it, and that is exactly what we are watching unfold. There is also a policy backdrop that makes all of this even more urgent. In June of 2026, the president signed 2 separate executive orders focused entirely on quantum technology. One order is about security, forcing federal agencies and government contractors to upgrade their encryption before quantum computers become powerful enough to break it. The other order is about acceleration, pushing research, commercialization, and workforce development forward as fast as possible. Together, these orders signal that the United States government now treats quantum computing the same way it once treated the space race or the early internet. That is not a small shift, and it changes what kind of leadership these companies need at the top. Now, let's actually get into the 6 companies, because each of these appointments tells its own story about where this industry is heading. The first company is Silicon Quantum Computing, often shortened to SQC, an Australian company known for building processors using atomic precision silicon, a completely different approach from the superconducting chips most people picture when they think of quantum hardware. SQC just appointed Karna Nisawaner as Chief Legal Officer, effective the 1st of June this year. Nisawaner brings more than 25 years of legal experience, and her background is not generic corporate law. She spent her most recent years as General Counsel and Corporate Secretary at Cadence, C-Design Systems, a company deeply embedded in the semiconductor industry. That detail matters more than it might seem at first glance. Think about what SQC actually needs right now. They are advancing an atomic precision silicon roadmap, which means they are creating intellectual property that sits at the exact intersection of quantum physics and traditional chip manufacturing. Hiring someone whose legal career was built inside the semiconductor world, rather than a generalist lawyer, tells you SQC expects intense patent activity, licensing negotiations, and regulatory complexity ahead. You do not hire that kind of specialist unless you are preparing for a much bigger stage than a research lab. Nisawaner will be based in Palo Alto, overseeing global corporate governance, the company's intellectual property portfolio, and regulatory compliance as SQC pushes its silicon quantum roadmap forward. It is also worth noting where SQC sits in the broader competitive landscape. Atomic precision silicon is a much less crowded approach than superconducting or trapped ion technology, which means the patent's SQC files now could define the entire category later. Getting the legal architecture right at this early stage is not a defensive move. It is an offensive one, designed to lock in intellectual property advantages before larger, better-funded competitors even realize the category exists. That is precisely the kind of long game a legal hire from inside the semiconductor world is built to play. The second company is Pascal, the French neutral atom quantum computing company that has become one of Europe's flagship players in this space. Pascal just named Stéphane Rougeot as its new chief financial officer. And if you look at Rougeot's resume, you will notice something specific. He has served as CFO and executive leader at publicly listed European technology and media companies, including Deezer, Signify, and Technicolor. Every single one of those names is a company that operates or has operated on public stock exchanges. That is not a coincidence either. Pascal is currently moving toward public markets through a pending transition and bringing in a CFO who has already lived. Through the discipline, the reporting requirements, and the investor relations demands of running a publicly listed company is a very deliberate move. This is a company preparing its financial operations, its investor relations function, and its capital market strategy for a completely different level of scrutiny than it has faced as a private company. Pascal also holds the highest physical qubit count in the neutral atom sector at 324 qubits, and it recently delivered a 140 qubit system to Sinica in Italy, with its Vela QPU set to launch later this year. This is a company with real hardware momentum that is now assembling the financial leadership to match it. There is a specific reason companies preparing for public markets go looking for finance leaders with media and telecommunications backgrounds, rather than someone pulled from inside another quantum startup. Investors evaluating a quantum company for the first time do not have decades of comparable data to lean on the way they would with a software company or a retailer. What they do have is trust in a CFO who has already proven they can manage investor expectations, quarterly reporting cycles, and capital markets pressure inside a completely different but equally complex industry. Rougeot's experience at Deezer, Signify, and Technicolor gives Pascal exactly that kind of credibility heading into its transition toward public markets. The third company is JIJ Incorporated, a Tokyo-based software startup that focuses on quantum optimization rather than hardware. JIJ just made its first major move into the American market by appointing Stephen Gibson as President of Americas and Andrew Ochoa as Principal Solution Architect. Both of these hires came from the same place, a company called Strangeworks, where Gibson served as Chief Commercial Officer and Ochoa served as Chief Scientist. Poaching an entire commercial and technical leadership pair from a single competitor is an aggressive move, and it tells you exactly what JIJ is trying to do. Gibson is now responsible for leading JIJ's commercial growth, its engagement with the public sector, and its partnerships with major cloud providers across the American region. This expansion did not happen in isolation. Just days earlier, JIJ signed a multi-year framework agreement with Kobe Steel in Japan to launch a quantum center of excellence focused on materials design and production scheduling. JIJ is simultaneously deepening its roots in Asia while planting a serious flag in the United States, and it is also active in Europe through its membership in the European Quantum Industry Consortium and UK Quantum. This is a company building a truly global footprint, and it needed leadership on the ground in America to make that footprint real rather than theoretical. Optimization software is one of the quietest but most commercially important corners of the entire quantum industry because it does not require a fault-tolerant quantum computer to already exist in order to deliver value. Companies like JIJ can sell quantum-inspired and hybrid quantum classical optimization tools to manufacturers, logistics companies, and financial institutions today, well before large-scale fault-tolerant hardware becomes commercially available. That gives JIJ a revenue path that many hardware-focused competitors simply do not have yet, and it explains why the company is moving aggressively into new regions, rather than waiting for the broader hardware race to play out first. The fourth company, and arguably the most dramatic of the six, is IQM Quantum Computers, a Finnish company that builds superconducting quantum systems. IQM did not just make a leadership appointment. It completed a full business combination with a company called Real Asset Acquisition Corporation, officially becoming the first publicly traded European quantum computing company on the Nasdaq exchange, trading under the ticker IQMX. As part of finalizing this transaction, IQM appointed two new members to its board of directors, Juho Sarvikas and Jeff Tudor. Sarvikas currently serves as CEO of Inseego Corporation and previously held senior roles at Qualcomm, HMD Global, and Microsoft, giving him deep experience across telecommunications and consumer technology. Tudor serves as co-chairman and chief financial officer of Real Asset Acquisition Corporation itself, and he also holds board positions at Inseego and GCT Semiconductor. With these additions, IQM's board now consists of 7 members under the continued chairmanship of Cirque Pudding. This transaction brought IQM roughly $233.5 million in capital, including a $145.5 million private investment component. IQM has already SOLED 23 quantum systems globally, with deployments at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and sales stretching into Japan, Italy, and Germany. Going public is not a symbolic milestone for this company. It is a funding mechanism, and the board appointments that came with it were chosen specifically to help IQM operate credibly as a public company moving forward. IQM's business model also sets it apart from many of its competitors, and that difference matters when you think about why its new board members were chosen. Rather than selling access to its machines primarily through a cloud subscription model, IQM focuses heavily on delivering full, on-premises quantum computers directly to research institutions, universities, and government labs. That is a fundamentally different sales motion than a cloud business, closer in structure to selling large scientific instruments or specialized industrial equipment than to selling software subscriptions. Board members with backgrounds in telecommunications, hardware, and structured finance, like Sarvikas and Tudor, bring exactly the kind of experience needed to support that kind of capital-intensive, equipment-focused sales strategy as it scales internationally. If you are finding this breakdown useful, this is exactly the kind of channel where I track these shifts as they happen, so go ahead and hit like on this video and subscribe so you do not miss the next wave of moves in this industry. The fifth company is IBM, the largest and longest running player in the entire quantum computing ecosystem. IBM promoted Talia Gershon to the role of a vice president and chief operating officer of both IBM Research and IBM Quantum combined. This was not an external hire. Gershon has spent more than a decade inside IBM's hardware and cloud organizations, managing initiatives that span semiconductor device research, cloud storage infrastructure, emerging technologies, and IBM's cloud-accessible quantum computing systems. The announcement itself came directly from Jay Gambetta, who leads IBM Quantum as a whole. This kind of internal promotion tells a different story than the other 5 companies on this list. IBM is not scrambling to bring in outside expertise because it lacks internal talent. It is consolidating operational control under someone who already understands every layer of the organization, from the research side all the way through to the commercial cloud platform. IBM currently operates the largest cloud-accessible quantum system fleet in the world, connecting more than 300 organizations through the IBM Quantum Network. Its roadmap includes the Kookaburra processor, expected this year, which introduces a new form of quantum memory alongside the industry's first logical processing unit architecture. Gershon's new role positions her to oversee the operational execution of that roadmap as it moves from experimental milestones towards something resembling a real product line. There is a lesson buried inside IBM's approach that is easy to miss if you're only looking at the other 5 companies on this list. Not every company facing this industry shift needs to hire externally. IBM's decades of institutional depth mean it already has people inside the organization who understand both the scientific roadmap and the commercial reality of running a global technology business. Promoting from within, rather than recruiting from outside, is its own kind of signal, and it tells you that IBM believes its internal bench of talent is strong enough to carry it through this next commercial phase without needing to look elsewhere. The 6th and final company is Postscriptum, a specialized investment office rather than a traditional quantum hardware or software company. Postscriptum is directed by technologist Peter Sarlin, who co-founded a company called Silo AI, and it just appointed Antti Vasara as its vice president of quantum. Vasara is not a typical corporate hire either. He previously served as president and chief executive officer of VTT Technical Research Center of Finland, and he currently holds the position of special envoy for technology to the Finnish Minister for Foreign Affairs. That is a genuinely unusual background for a private investment appointment, and it reflects how tightly connected Finland's national research infrastructure has become with its private quantum investment strategy. Vasara's mandate at Postscriptum is to guide a €30 million capital commitment, roughly $34 million, toward foundational hardware technologies that the entire quantum industry depends on, but rarely gets attention for. Things like cryoelectronics, sub-Kelvin cooling systems, and advanced attenuation components. His first move in the role was already public. Postscriptum made a strategic equity investment in a company called Semicon, a Finnish hardware developer that builds cryo-CMOS control and readout microchips designed to operate directly inside the ultras, cold environments surrounding quantum processors. Semicon was originally spun out of VTT itself, the very research center Vasara used to lead, which makes this appointment feel less like a random hire and more like the closing of a loop between Finland's public research base and its emerging private quantum economy. Postscriptum's entire strategy also highlights a part of the quantum industry that almost never makes headlines, but that every single hardware company quietly depends on: Nobody talks about cryoelectronics or sub-Kelvin attenuation components the way they talk about qubit counts or error correction breakthroughs. Yet none of those flashy milestones are possible without the unglamorous hardware layer sitting underneath them. By appointing someone with Vasara's national research pedigree to direct capital specifically toward that layer, Postscriptum is effectively betting that the biggest bottleneck in quantum computing over the next several years will not be the qubits themselves, but the supporting infrastructure required to keep those qubits stable, controllable, and scalable. So now that you understand each individual move, let's zoom out and talk about why all 6 of these are happening within days of each other, because that timing is not random. The quantum computing industry just crossed a threshold that analysts are now calling the capability era. According to the most recent State of Quantum report for 2026, based on research and interviews across more than 100 practitioners, 89% of enterprises surveyed are now hands-on with quantum technology in some form. But only 3% of those enterprises have actually reached scaled deployment. That gap between experimentation and real scaled use is exactly where the industry currently sits, and it explains everything about why leadership is changing so quickly across so many companies at once. When an industry is purely experimental, you need scientists at the top. When an industry starts moving towards scaled deployment, you need people who can manage legal risk, financial reporting, government relationships, and large-scale commercial partnerships. Every single one of the 6 appointments we just walked through fits that exact pattern. A legal specialist from the semiconductor world, a finance executive from public media and technology companies, a commercial leader poached specifically to build an American presence, a board expanded specifically to support a public listing, an internal operator promoted to unify research and commercial execution, and an investment strategist appointed to direct capital toward the hardware bottlenecks nobody else wants to fund. There's another layer to this worth understanding, and it involves how procurement itself is changing. The same industry report found that buyers are shifting away from simply chasing qubit counts as their main measure of progress. Instead, openness, calibration access, and the quality of code development are becoming the more important criteria. In plain language, enterprise customers no longer want to be handed a sealed black box quantum system they cannot inspect or integrate with their existing infrastructure. They want to see inside the machine, calibrate it themselves, and retain the technical capability they build while working with these vendors. That shift changes what these companies need to sell, and it changes who needs to be in the room negotiating those deals. It is not a coincidence that so many of these new hires sit at the intersection of legal, financial, and partnership functions, rather than pure engineering roles. Somewhere in a laboratory right now, a machine is being cooled to a temperature colder than the empty vacuum of deep space, colder than Pluto, colder than anywhere else in the known universe. Just so a handful of particles can perform a calculation, your laptop finishes in a fraction of a second without breaking a sweat. That contradiction sits at the very heart of quantum computing, a technology hyped as the death of ordinary computers, when in reality it is something far stranger, far more limited, and far more fascinating than most headlines ever bother to explain. By the end of this video, you will actually understand how these machines work, and exactly why the laptop sitting on your desk right now is not going anywhere anytime soon. Let's start with the most basic building block, because everything else depends on getting this right. Your laptop, your phone, every computer you have ever used processes information using bits, tiny switches that can only ever be in one of 2 states, a 0 or a 1, off or on, nothing in between. Every photo you have ever taken, every video you have ever streamed, every message you have ever sent, all of it eventually breaks down into unbelievably long strings of these simple zeros and ones, flipped billions of times per second by transistors etched into silicon. That system has worked remarkably well for nearly a century, and it is still the only reasonable way to check your email or scroll through social media. Quantum computers throw that entire foundation out the window and replace it with something called a qubit, short for quantum bit. And this single substitution changes absolutely everything about how the machine actually computes. If the idea of something existing in 2 states at once genuinely bends your brain a little, make sure you like this video, because it is about to get considerably stranger. A classical bit can only be a 0 or a 1, full stop, no exceptions. A qubit, thanks to a genuinely bizarre property of quantum mechanics called superposition, can exist as a 0, a 1, or, remarkably, some blended combination of both states simultaneously, right up until the exact moment someone actually measures it. Picture a spinning coin while it is still spinning. In the air, it is not really heads or tails. It is some mixture of both possibilities at once, and only the instant it lands and you look at it does that possibility collapse into one definite outcome. Qubits behave in roughly that same way, existing in a hazy blend of possibilities that only resolves into a solid 0 or 1 the moment you check. This single property is precisely why quantum computers can, in certain very specific situations, explore an enormous number of possibilities all at the same time, rather than checking them one after another the way your laptop's processor is forced to. Here's where the math starts to feel genuinely mind-bending, and it is worth slowing down for. 1 qubit in superposition represents 2 possible states at once. 2 qubits together can represent 4 states simultaneously. 3 qubits jump to 8 states. Every additional qubit you add doubles the total number of states the system can represent all at once, which means the computational space grows exponentially rather than one step at a time. A modest 50-qubit quantum computer, at least in theory, could represent more simultaneous states than there are atoms in every grain of sand on every beach on planet Earth combined. That exponential scaling is the entire reason physicists and technology companies have spent literally billions of dollars chasing this technology, because certain specific categories of problems that would take a classical supercomputer millions of years to brute force through could theoretically be explored by a sufficiently powerful, error-free quantum computer in a matter of days or even hours. But superposition alone is not the whole story, and this next part is honestly the strangest concept in all of modern physics, a phenomenon called entanglement. When 2 qubits become entangled, their fates become mathematically linked together in a way that has no equivalent anywhere in classical computing or, frankly, anywhere in ordinary human experience. Measure 1, entangled qubit, and you instantly know something definite about its entangled partner, even if that partner happens to be sitting on the opposite side of the planet, or, in principle, the opposite side of the universe. Albert Einstein himself found this idea so uncomfortable that he famously dismissed it as, in his own words, spooky action at a distance, and spent years of his life trying to prove quantum mechanics had to be incomplete because of it. He turned out to be wrong. Entanglement is genuinely real, a fact confirmed so rigorously that the physicists who demonstrated it experimentally were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022. Inside a quantum computer, entanglement is what allows qubits to coordinate with one another in ways ordinary bits simply cannot, letting the machine explore correlations between different pieces of a problem simultaneously rather than examining each piece in isolation. If you're the kind of person who enjoys having your assumptions about reality gently dismantled, subscribe now, because understanding how these 2 properties actually get turned into a working calculation is where this story becomes genuinely practical rather than purely theoretical. A quantum computation generally follows a fairly consistent 4-step process. First, every qubit gets initialized into a known, simple starting state, essentially set to a clean, predictable 0. Second, a carefully designed sequence of what are called quantum gates gets applied to the system, the quantum equivalent of the logic gates inside your laptop's processor. Except these gates manipulate qubits through superposition and entanglement rather than simple binary switching. Third, the qubits get measured, and this measurement is the crucial, almost violent moment where all of that delicate superposition collapses down into a definite string of ordinary zeros, and ones that a regular computer can actually read and interpret. Fourth, because the entire process is fundamentally probabilistic rather than deterministic, the calculation typically has to be run over and over again, sometimes thousands of times, a process researchers literally call taking shots, in order to statistically tease out the most likely correct answer from all that quantum noise and uncertainty. That probabilistic, repeat it thousands of times, workflow already hints at the first major reason quantum computers cannot simply replace your laptop. But the physical engineering challenges run even deeper than that. Most quantum computers built today, particularly the superconducting variety used by companies like Google and IBM, need to be cooled down to temperatures within a hair's breadth of absolute 0, roughly negative 273 degrees Celsius, using elaborate dilution refrigerators that are themselves incredibly